The German military intelligence apparatus during World War II was among the most sophisticated in the world. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, and later the intelligence branches of the Wehrmacht and the SS, employed thousands of analysts, agents, and specialists who studied enemy capabilities, tracked enemy movements, and attempted to predict enemy intentions. They maintained detailed files on Allied commanders, analyzed their tactics, and developed profiles of their decision-making patterns. For most of the war, German intelligence was remarkably effective, providing accurate assessments that allowed German commanders to make informed decisions about defensive preparations and operational planning. But when it came to General George S. Patton, German intelligence made a series of critical errors in assessment and prediction that would cost Germany dearly in terms of lost battles, wasted resources, and strategic miscalculations. This is the story of what German intelligence got wrong about Patton and how those errors contributed to Germany's defeat in Western Europe. The German intelligence community's first major error regarding Patton was fundamentally getting something right, but for the wrong reasons. From early in the war, German analysts correctly identified Patton as the most dangerous and capable Allied ground commander. They tracked his career from North Africa through Sicily, noting his aggressive tactics, his rapid advances, and his ability to inspire his troops to extraordinary performance. German commanders who faced Patton's forces reported that he was qualitatively different from other Allied generals, more willing to take risks, more focused on exploitation and pursuit, and more dangerous when he achieved breakthrough. All of this was accurate, and it led German intelligence to conclude that Patton was the Allies' premier offensive commander. Where German intelligence went wrong was in assuming that the Allies would use their best commander in the most important operations. This was logical from a German perspective because it was how the German military operated. The Wehrmacht consistently placed its most capable commanders in positions where they could have maximum impact. If the Germans had a commander of Patton's caliber, they would have given him the leading role in their most critical operations. German intelligence analysts assumed the Allies would do the same, and this assumption would lead them into a trap that would have enormous strategic consequences. The trap was Operation Fortitude, the elaborate Allied deception plan designed to convince the Germans that the D-Day landings at Normandy were a feint, and that the main invasion would come at Calais. The centerpiece of this deception was the fictional 1st United States Army Group, supposedly positioned in southeast England and preparing for the main invasion. And the commander of this fictional army group was George S. Patton. The Allies understood that if they made Patton the nominal commander of the Calais invasion force, German intelligence would believe that Calais was indeed where the main attack would come, because they would never waste their best commander on a secondary operation. German intelligence fell completely for this deception, and the error was rooted in their accurate assessment of Patton's capabilities, combined with their false assumption about how the Allies would employ him. When German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the elaborate dummy installations in southeast England, when German agents reported on the radio traffic and troop movements associated with 1st United States Army Group, and when they confirmed that Patton was in command of these forces, German intelligence concluded with high confidence that the main Allied invasion would come at Calais, with Patton leading it. This miscalculation had catastrophic consequences for Germany's defense of France. Adolf Hitler, already predisposed to believe that Calais was the logical invasion point because it was the shortest route across the English Channel, seized on the intelligence about Patton's location and role as confirmation of his strategic intuition. When the Allies landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, Hitler initially believed it was a diversionary attack designed to draw German reserves away from Calais before Patton launched the real invasion. This belief kept powerful German armored divisions, including the 15th Army, positioned at Calais for crucial weeks after D-Day, waiting for Patton's attack that would never come. The German intelligence error about Patton's role in D-Day planning was not simply about being deceived by Allied deception operations, though that was certainly part of it. The deeper error was epistemological, a mistake about how to interpret information and how to test assumptions. German intelligence had correctly identified that Patton was the Allies' most capable offensive commander. But instead of considering multiple hypotheses about what this meant for Allied planning, they locked onto a single explanation and then interpreted all subsequent information through that lens. When they learned Patton was in southeast England, they saw it as confirmation of the Calais invasion. They never seriously considered the alternative hypothesis that the Allies might deliberately place Patton where he could be observed, precisely to deceive German intelligence about Allied intentions. This failure of imagination, this inability to consider that the enemy might be deliberately feeding information to exploit German analytical assumptions, was a critical flaw in German intelligence methodology. Good intelligence analysis requires considering multiple competing hypotheses and actively seeking evidence that might disprove your favored explanation. German intelligence failed to do this with Patton, and they paid an enormous price for that failure in the weeks after D-Day, when German forces were positioned to defend against a threat that didn't exist, while the actual invasion consolidated its beachhead. The second major error German intelligence made about Patton was underestimating how quickly he could shift from deception operations to actual combat command and achieve operational impact. When Third Army became operational on August 1, 1944, following the Allied breakout from Normandy, German intelligence initially failed to recognize the significance of this development. They had become so focused on Patton as the phantom commander of the non-existent 1st United States Army Group that they were slow to adjust to the reality of Patton commanding an actual army, conducting actual operations in Normandy. This analytical lag, this delay in updating their assessment to reflect changed circumstances, cost Germany dearly in the opening weeks of Third Army's operations. German defensive planning in late July and early August 1944 was based on expectations about American capabilities and operational patterns that had been developed by observing other American commanders. When Patton's Third Army burst out of the Normandy pocket and began its spectacular dash across France, German commanders were caught unprepared for the speed and audacity of the advance. They had intelligence about Third Army's existence and Patton's command, but they hadn't adjusted their operational planning quickly enough to account for what this would mean for the battlefield situation. German intelligence also made a critical error in assessing Patton's logistical constraints and how he would respond to them. German analysts correctly calculated that Allied supply lines were stretched thin as armies advanced away from the Normandy beaches, and they accurately predicted that fuel shortages would constrain Allied operations. Where they went wrong was in assuming that these logistical constraints would affect all Allied armies equally, and that commanders would respond to fuel shortages by halting their advances and waiting for supplies to catch up. This was a reasonable assumption based on standard military doctrine, and it was how most Allied commanders did, in fact, respond to supply shortages. But Patton was not most commanders, and he did not respond to logistical constraints the way doctrine prescribed. When his fuel supplies ran low, Patton continued advancing, scrounging fuel wherever he could find it, capturing German fuel depots, and generally treating logistical limitations as problems to be overcome through improvisation rather than as absolute constraints on operations. German intelligence failed to anticipate this response, and German operational planning based on expectations of Allied pauses for resupply was repeatedly confounded by Patton's refusal to halt when conventional wisdom said he should. A related error concerned German intelligence assessments of Patton's willingness to take operational risks. German analysts understood that Patton was aggressive, but they assumed there were limits to the risks even he would accept. They believed that Patton, like any competent commander, would not advance so far ahead of adjacent units that his flanks became dangerously exposed. They assumed he would not push forward with such inadequate logistics that his army risked becoming immobilized in enemy territory. They thought he would follow at least the basic principles of military art regarding security and sustainability of operations. All of these assumptions were wrong. Patton was willing to accept levels of operational risk that German intelligence, using conventional military logic, judged to be unacceptable. He would advance with exposed flanks if he believed the enemy was too disorganized to exploit those vulnerabilities. He would push forward despite inadequate fuel if he believed momentum was more valuable than security. He would violate standard military principles if he judged that the specific circumstances warranted it. German intelligence consistently underestimated Patton's risk tolerance, and this led them to be surprised repeatedly by advances they had assessed as too risky for any rational commander to attempt. This systematic underestimation of Patton's risk tolerance created a pattern where German defensive planning was always positioned to defend against what conventional military logic suggested Patton would do, only to find that he had done something more aggressive and more unexpected. German commanders would establish defensive lines where they calculated Patton's advance would naturally pause, only to discover that he had already pushed beyond those positions. They would position reserves to counterattack what they thought would be Patton's next objective, only to find that he had bypassed that objective entirely and was already advancing toward targets deeper in the rear. German intelligence also made significant errors in assessing Patton's personal characteristics and how those would influence his operational decisions. They correctly identified that Patton was intensely competitive and that he was engaged in what amounted to a personal rivalry with British Field Marshal Montgomery for glory and recognition. But they failed to understand how this competition would shape Patton's operational choices. German intelligence assumed that the competition between Patton and Montgomery would lead to inter-Allied friction that Germany could potentially exploit, that the Allies might fail to coordinate effectively because of personal rivalries between commanders. What actually happened was that Patton's competitive drive with Montgomery pushed him to take even greater risks and advance even more aggressively than he might have otherwise. The competition didn't weaken Allied effectiveness, but rather intensified it, at least in Patton's case. When Montgomery's forces were making headlines with their advances, Patton drove his own forces even harder to ensure that Third Army's achievements matched or exceeded those of British forces. German intelligence had correctly identified the rivalry, but had incorrectly assessed its operational implications. Another personality-based error concerned Patton's attitude toward casualties. German intelligence analysts, observing the careful casualty-conscious approach of most Allied commanders, assumed that fear of casualties was a constraint on Allied operations. They believed that American public opinion would not tolerate high casualty rates, and that this would make Allied commanders cautious about operations that might result in significant losses. This assessment was generally accurate for most Allied commanders, but it underestimated Patton's willingness to accept casualties if he believed they were necessary to achieve important objectives. Patton was not careless with his soldiers' lives, but he was willing to accept casualty rates that other Allied commanders would have found unacceptable if he believed that aggressive action would achieve decisive results. German intelligence failed to account for this difference, and their defensive planning sometimes assumed levels of American casualty sensitivity that didn't apply to Patton's operations. This led to situations where German forces prepared defenses designed to inflict casualties that would deter Allied attacks, only to find that Patton attacked anyway, accepting the casualties as the price of maintaining momentum. German intelligence also made critical errors in assessing Patton's relationship with his superiors and how much autonomy he had in operational decision-making. German analysts knew that there was friction between Patton and higher headquarters, that he had been sidelined after the slapping incidents in Sicily, and that he had a reputation for being difficult to control. From this information, they concluded that Patton's operational freedom was constrained, that he was on a short leash and would be closely supervised by Eisenhower and Bradley to prevent him from creating more scandals. This assessment was partially correct, but missed the crucial nuance. While Eisenhower and Bradley did try to control Patton and did impose constraints on his operations, they also recognized his value as a combat commander and gave him more operational freedom than they gave other Army commanders. Moreover, Patton was skilled at finding ways to pursue his own operational agenda, even when officially constrained by orders from higher headquarters. He would claim communication failures, report situations in ways that justified the actions he wanted to take, and generally operate with more independence than his official position suggested. German intelligence failed to fully appreciate this dynamic, and they sometimes based their defensive planning on assumptions that Patton would be constrained by orders from higher headquarters, only to discover that he had found ways to circumvent those constraints. The gap between what German intelligence thought Patton was allowed to do and what he actually did created opportunities for Third Army to achieve surprise and exploit situations that German planners thought were foreclosed by Allied command decisions. A particularly costly German intelligence error concerned the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When Germany launched its surprise offensive through the Ardennes, German planning was based partly on assessments of how quickly Allied forces could respond. German intelligence calculated that it would take at least a week, probably longer, for substantial Allied forces to be redeployed from other sectors to counterattack the German penetration. This estimate was based on historical data about how long it took military organizations to disengage from current operations, move substantial distances, and launch coordinated attacks. The estimate would have been accurate for most military organizations, but it drastically underestimated what Patton and Third Army could accomplish. When Patton announced at the emergency meeting of Allied commanders that he could attack the southern flank of the German penetration within 48 hours, most of the other commanders thought he was being unrealistic. But German intelligence should have known better. They had observed Third Army's performance for months. They had seen Patton's ability to move forces quickly and attack with minimal preparation. Yet their planning for the Ardennes offensive assumed response times that applied to conventional forces, not to Third Army under Patton's command. The result was that German forces attacking toward the west through the Ardennes suddenly found themselves under attack from the south, far earlier than their planning had anticipated. The entire timetable for the German offensive was disrupted by Patton's rapid response. German intelligence had made the classic mistake of using average performance data to predict the behavior of an outlier, and they paid for that error with the failure of their last major offensive in the West. German intelligence also consistently misunderstood the relationship between Patton's public persona and his actual operational capabilities. They knew that Patton was famous for his flamboyant personality, his profanity-laced speeches, his pearl-handled revolvers, and his carefully cultivated image as a warrior from an earlier age. German analysts debated whether this persona was genuine or was calculated image-making designed to inspire his troops and intimidate enemies. What they failed to understand was that the public Patton and the operational Patton were both real and that they reinforced each other. Some German intelligence assessments dismissed Patton as more showman than soldier, suggesting that his reputation exceeded his actual capabilities, and that his success was largely due to overwhelming Allied material superiority, rather than his own skill. These assessments were not just wrong, but dangerously wrong, because they led to underestimation of the threat Third Army posed. Other German assessments went to the opposite extreme, treating Patton as some kind of military Superman whose forces were invincible. This overestimation was less dangerous but still problematic because it led to excessive allocation of German reserves to sectors where Patton was operating, weakening other parts of the front. The correct assessment, which German intelligence never quite achieved, was that Patton was an exceptionally skilled operational commander, whose abilities were particularly well suited to exploitation and pursuit operations, who had significant weaknesses in other areas like political judgment and coalition management, and whose effectiveness was multiplied by the material superiority of American forces, but was not solely dependent on that superiority. This nuanced assessment would have allowed for better German operational planning, but it eluded German intelligence throughout the war. Another significant error involved German intelligence assessments of how Patton would prioritize different types of objectives. German analysts knew that Patton was goal-oriented and would focus on objectives he deemed important, but they misjudged what types of objectives he would prioritize. German intelligence assumed that Patton, like most commanders, would prioritize militarily significant objectives such as transportation hubs, supply depots, and defensive strongpoints. They failed to fully appreciate that Patton was equally or more motivated by symbolic objectives, by the opportunity to achieve firsts, and by operations that would generate positive publicity. This led to situations where German forces prepared strong defenses at militarily logical objectives, only to find that Patton had bypassed them in favor of objectives that had greater symbolic or public relations value. The race to Messina in Sicily, where Patton was more interested in beating Montgomery to the city than in conducting militarily optimal operations, should have taught German intelligence something about Patton's operational priorities. But they continued to analyze his operations using conventional military logic rather than accounting for the personal and psychological factors that influenced his decision-making. German intelligence also failed to adequately account for Patton's use of deception and misdirection at the operational level. While they were aware that the Allies employed strategic deception, as demonstrated by Operation Fortitude, they underestimated how Patton used similar techniques at the operational and tactical levels. Patton was skilled at creating false impressions about where his main attacks would come, at using demonstrative actions in one sector to mask preparations in another, and at generally keeping German intelligence uncertain about his actual intentions. This consistent ability to achieve operational surprise, to attack where and when German intelligence wasn't expecting it, was one of Patton's most valuable capabilities, and one that German intelligence never adequately countered. They would develop assessments of Third Army's likely next moves based on conventional military logic, and Patton would do something different. The pattern repeated throughout the campaign in France and Germany, yet German intelligence never developed effective methods for predicting Patton's actual intentions rather than his doctrinally logical intentions. Perhaps the most fundamental error German intelligence made regarding Patton was treating him as a conventional military problem that could be understood and countered using conventional intelligence methods. They applied the same analytical frameworks they used for other Allied commanders, the same assessment criteria, the same predictive models. But Patton was not a conventional commander, and conventional analytical methods were inadequate for understanding and predicting his behavior. He combined elements of traditional cavalry dash, modern mechanized warfare, personal flamboyance, strategic insight, tactical recklessness, and political tone deafness in ways that defied easy categorization. German intelligence would have been better served by treating Patton as a unique case requiring specialized analysis, but their organizational structure and analytical culture didn't support that kind of individualized approach. They had systems for assessing enemy forces, standard templates for evaluating commanders, established procedures for predicting enemy intentions. Patton didn't fit neatly into any of these systems, and rather than adapting their methods to account for his unique characteristics, German intelligence tried to force him into their existing analytical frameworks. The result was a consistent pattern of misassessment and surprise. The cumulative cost of these German intelligence errors regarding Patton was substantial. The misassessment of his role in D-Day planning kept German forces positioned to defend against a threat that didn't exist, while the actual invasion established itself. The underestimation of his operational speed led to German defensive positions being overrun before they were fully prepared. The failure to account for his risk tolerance meant German counterattack plans were based on false assumptions about where Third Army would be. The miscalculation about his response time in the Battle of the Bulge disrupted the timetable of Germany's last offensive. Each of these errors had tactical and operational consequences, and cumulatively they contributed significantly to Germany's defeat in Western Europe. What makes these errors particularly interesting from an intelligence analysis perspective is that many of them resulted not from lack of information, but from analytical failures in interpreting the information that was available. German intelligence had extensive data on Patton's operations, access to American newspapers that covered his actions and quoted his statements, and reports from German commanders who had faced his forces. The raw material for accurate assessment was available. What was lacking was the analytical framework and the intellectual flexibility to correctly interpret that material and generate accurate predictions about Patton's future actions. The German intelligence failures regarding Patton offer lessons that remain relevant for intelligence analysis today. The importance of challenging your own assumptions, of considering alternative hypotheses, of recognizing when an individual case doesn't fit your standard analytical models, of understanding that enemies may deliberately feed you information to exploit your analytical biases. All of these lessons emerge from examining what German intelligence got wrong about Patton. Modern intelligence agencies study these failures as examples of how even sophisticated intelligence organizations can make serious errors when they rely too heavily on conventional wisdom and fail to adapt their analytical methods to unique situations. In the final analysis, what German intelligence got wrong about Patton was not any single assessment, but rather a pattern of errors rooted in false assumptions about how Allied command would employ its best generals, in underestimation of Patton's willingness to take risks and violate conventional doctrine, in failure to account for personal factors that influenced his operational decisions, and in attempting to analyze an unconventional commander using conventional analytical frameworks. These errors were compounded by the natural human tendency to interpret new information in ways that confirm existing beliefs, rather than challenging those beliefs when evidence suggests they might be wrong. Germany paid for these intelligence errors with lost battles, wasted resources, and strategic miscalculations that hastened their defeat. The irony is that German intelligence was in many ways correct in their overall assessment that Patton was the Allies' most dangerous ground commander. Where they went wrong was in failing to fully understand the implications of that assessment, and in making false assumptions about how the Allies would use him and how he would operate. In warfare, being right about the big picture is not enough if you're wrong about the crucial details, and German intelligence was consistently wrong about the details of Patton's operations, in ways that cost Germany dearly in the final year of World War II.